Hi, folks. Thanks for tuning in to Sunday School Bonanza by This Week in Mormons. Go see us at thisweekinmormons.com. Shoot us an email, contact@thisweekinmormons.com. And if you're listening to this on any medium, like other than iTunes, go subscribe on iTunes. But we're grateful that you're here regardless of how you got here. Just glad you were around. So we're going to go over some gospel doctrine today and get you prepared, whether you're teaching, attending, can't go because of another calling, whatever it may be. We hope this will be of use to you. But before we get to that, I'm joined once again by one of my favorite humans on earth. Bill Doolittle is here.
Jeff, it's so fun being here with you.
I love this guy. Are you being serious when you say it's fun?
It's a blast.
We're both very deadpan people, so sometimes, it's
no, look, I mean, I get to sit here and people will listen to me say what I think about things. Like, that doesn't happen as often as I would like.
Bill doesn't have a This Week in Mormons email address, but if you want to direct anything at me, Jeff, Geoff, at thisweekinmormons.com, feel free to do so, and I can give Bill feedback about how he's doing.
All constructive criticism.
Because Bill had a good story earlier, actually, we were talking about criticism he was receiving Bill's a vocal performer.
Yeah.
And so Bill thinks that when someone says, I have some criticism, it means that Bill can criticize them.
Right.
But actually, he needs to receive the criticism.
So be gentle. I have a weak ego.
And speaking of great ways to get through affliction and criticism, Lesson 12 is the one we're on this week, Fruitful in the Land of My Affliction. Last week, you might recall, of course, we talked a lot about Joseph and everything that went on with him, a lot of troubling things, but things we can discuss. And this week, more Joseph and his brethren, et cetera, et cetera. But before we get to that, something special happens before to lead this lesson.
This has to be my favorite attention activity in the Sunday school manuals. It starts off with
so happy
with it's just so great. So it says, ask class members to imagine that they have died and enter the spirit world. Which when I read that, I was like, I imagine this lesson now being taught by that guy who hosts the midnight horror radio show, like, this week you have died.
Yes.
In a world where laughter has died. So you have to imagine that you have died, and then you enter the spirit world, and now you're supposed to, and this gets back to Jeff's point, like last week, Joseph has all these great, suffering. He does all this horrible things happen to him, and then he comes back around, and in the lesson this week, we see how he flourishes in the suffering, right? So the attention activity is not just to imagine that you have died, but it also is to think about what you would say to yourself about how you face trials in mortal life. What were your trials? What lessons did you learn from them? What would you do differently? How could you have better taken advantage of life's experiences? And Joseph gives us a lot of great examples here. So we're going to get like 3 or 4 just in this small section.
So, yeah, we got a lot of good stuff going on. Yeah, Joseph has been through terrible ordeals, but there are blessings in every way. I mean, he'd been righteous through all of this. One of the great things is that he's still alive, because after the whole thing with Potiphar's wife, I think anyone else would have just been killed and not even thought anything else about. We've wondered if the Pharaoh kind of knew better in these incidents and was just like, well, I've got to do something for show so the people to appease the people.
But he knew about his wife.
Yeah.
I mean,
you got to appease the people, just like Saul in 1 Samuel.
Right. You got to look strong. Maybe even tell him you killed Joseph, but you just sent him to prison.
Yeah, exactly. The things we noticed: hated by his brothers, sold into slavery, unjustly imprisoned, all of that stuff. But Joseph responds well to all of these things. And while he's in prison with Pharaoh's butler and baker. So apparently Pharaoh is neither being dressed nor is he eating. But
he's still got his candlesticks.
Yeah. So
because the candlestick maker.
I got it.
Sorry.
But they both had dreams that they did not understand. And Joseph could be of use because Joseph was privy to basically interpretation of dreams. That was a spiritual gift that he had. And real quickly, what did they dream about?
So they both actually dreamed about work, which is a little boring. But the butler dreamed that he saw 3 vines and they had grapes on it, and then he takes the grapes and he makes wine into a cup and gives the cup to Pharaoh. And then the baker dreamed that he had like a basket full of baked goods that he'd made for the Pharaoh, and then birds came and ate them all up.
Okay. And this is all Genesis 40, by the way, if you want to read these things for yourself. Because something sort of tragic happens. Is it the butler or the butler gets out, right?
The butler makes it because Joseph says, him giving the cup of wine to the Pharaoh, he says, the interpretation of that dream is, you will in 3 days. The 3 vines are 3 days, and in 3 days you will be serving the Pharaoh again. But the baker doesn't make it.
Yeah. But the sad thing here's the butler. Now Joseph gives him specific instructions. What he basically says is, hey, remember me when you're out there. Remember to mention me to the Pharaoh, that I interpreted your dream, that I am of value, that I am wasting away in a prison when I could be of service.
Right. Basically. And to the baker, he says, I want you to imagine that you have died. Because you're about to.
But then the sad thing we see in verse 23 in Genesis 40, it says, yet did not the chief butler remember Joseph, but forgot him. Until 2 years later, when the Pharaoh has a dream again, doesn't know what it means. This was a crazy dream. This is the one with the 7
cows.
The cows.
Eating each other.
So cows eat each other.
So it's the fat and the lean kind. And so the seven fat kind come up out of the water, and they're grazing, and the 7 lean kind follow them up and then eat, cannibalize the other cows, which is a pretty horrific dream, I mean, he probably wondered, what did I have last night,
And so, absinthe, probably, lots of absinthe. And so because of this, all of a sudden the butler says, wait a second. I knew a guy in the clink.
I knew.
All right? I met this guy. He knows a guy. And he knows something about dreams. He can tell you things.
He can help you. It'll cost you.
So anyway, Joseph by this point has spent 2 more years in prison, actually, this whole time. But he gets brought out. He interprets the Pharaoh's dream. And, of course, this is actually discussing these 7 years of plenty to be followed by 7 years of famine. And Joseph basically instructs the Pharaoh, all right, you need to start pooling stuff together because this is legit. Your dream is not just some random trip you're having. There's going to be a serious famine in all the land. And we have a great responsibility here in Egypt to prepare for it. And then the Pharaoh's response says, great, well, you're my number one now.
Yeah, I'm gonna put you back in charge.
I'm assuming the Pharaoh's lands were greater than Egypt itself, but Joseph was effectively governor of Egypt at this point.
Got everything
An
back.
incredible position of power.
Which,
especially for a Canaanite.
Right.
Of all people.
He's a foreigner, and we're putting him in charge. Just like Jurgen Klinsmann,
just like Barack
coaching
Obama.
It's sort of like Barack Obama, but it's more like the German coach of the American soccer team. But one of the things I really like about this is the fact that Joseph, when he was helping the baker and the butler, this is how you know he was a legitimately good guy. He didn't have any reason to think, oh, these guys are gonna they're gonna be able to get me out of prison, right? He asks the butler. But he's willing to interpret their dream for them, without making any kind of, he asks, but, he doesn't have any reason that this is going to help him. And if I'd been stuck in prison a long time, you could really, start feeling pretty selfish and down on yourself. Everybody else is kind of on their own. I'm not going to help people. And he didn't take that approach. And that's really a credit to his character.
Yeah, definitely. And of course, there's a quote here, how can we prepare for famine? Because famine, there's a literal sense, there's a figurative sense. Elder L. Tom Perry has some things to say, and the main ones: first, gain an adequate education, because then we'll be able to obtain steady employment and take care of ourselves and others. Second, live strictly within your income and save something for a rainy day, which I can very much attest to. Third, avoid excessive debt. And then fourth, acquire and store a reserve of actual food storage in the case of an emergency. And those all apply to us today. And I love seeing how applicable it was even during this time in Egypt, because during the famine, what happened? You had everyone else around said, well, we've got nothing, but Egypt stocked up all this stuff, and Egypt was in a wonderful position, not for profiteering, but to be able to actually help people out. And we ourselves can learn from that, I think, as well, in being, we got to take care of ourselves and then some, and then we can better serve the kingdom and take care of other people.
And in fact, I mean, they were terribly successful. And Joseph now, because of his wisdom in serving the Pharaoh, again, he probably he didn't know that this was going to lead to the reconciliation of his family, right?
Okay, yeah.
But he, continued to serve Pharaoh. I mean, he didn't have a choice. It was that or prison. But he gave this wisdom to the Pharaoh and helped him build up his supplies. And then he administered and brought all these people in. And of the people he was helping, we see included his family. And now in this very different position from when he last saw them, in which they sold him into slavery, right? They come back down to seek food because they're starving up in Jacob and his family are starving up in Canaan. And so he comes down, and Joseph recognizes them, of course, and he plays around with them a little bit. Like he is going to help them. We know he's going to help them. But I don't blame him. He messes with them a little bit, makes them think,
well, how does he
plants cash in their bag. So they come down to purchase all this food. And he takes the money, but then he slips the money back in their bag. And then when they come back, he says, "Oh, you stole it." But then he does the same with this cup. The second time, because they come to buy twice, right? The second time, in the first time he says, "How is your father?" Because he's pretending not to be himself, right?
Yeah.
But, as we were talking about before, as you mentioned, he has these great moments where he has to go like regain his composure. Like when he hears that his father is alive and that Benjamin's alive.
Especially when he dines with them too. Yeah. It's amazing. Yeah.
And he holds it together, but then he has to like run in the other room and weep for joy. And then he comes back. So he's trying to keep a straight face here, but he's so, overjoyed about, especially his father and Benjamin. So
I forgot. Was it that after the first time he like commanded that they return and bring Benjamin? Was that Joseph's command to his brothers? Right?
Yeah, they had to go up and come back and bring Benjamin with them.
And I assume that was both to see Benjamin and also to test their father, because he was afraid of losing another son.
Right.
I mean,
right. And he was so afraid of it that he wasn't going to let Benjamin go. And then we get Judah says, "Look, we've got it." Judah says, "Look, I've talked to this Joseph guy." Or whatever he was going by down in Egypt, so it wasn't obvious that it was his brother.
And Judah, for background, of course, was the one who was primarily responsible for betraying Joseph. Interesting parallel to Judah, the Hebrew, and then Judas in the New Testament is just the Greek name of Judah. It's the exact. Yeah. It's basically the same thing.
Well, I didn't know that.
And both betrayed for financial gain. Interesting, no? Parallels.
Yeah, and fortunately, he doesn't get his innards dashed out in a field, but he doesn't as Judas. He manages to go up and he gets Benjamin, but he has to agree with Jacob. He says, "Look, Father, I'll take Benjamin down, but if I will stand in for him, so I guarantee with my own life that I will bring this son back to you." So he takes him down, and then Joseph plants the silver cup in Benjamin's bag because he wants to keep Benjamin, right?
Yeah.
And then they send him away, and then he sends his people after him, and he says, "Oh, you stole this cup." And they say, or he says to all of them, "Whoever has the cup," the brothers say, "Whoever has the cup, you can take him back, but we didn't steal it." Well, it's in Benjamin's bag. So Judah comes now, realizing that his life is on the line anyway, and says, "Look, will you allow me to stand in, because I promised my father that this kid would go back up?" And Joseph breaks, right? And he says,
he can't do it anymore.
"All right, guys, it's me."
You've been punked.
You've been an awesomely punked. Okay, so having gone through all of that, now he gets this wonderful reconciliation with his family, and you see that he reconciles with them. There's an interesting question. It talks about the fact that the brothers, as they're heading back in, this is in Genesis 42 and 21, talks about how they still feel guilty. And then it asks this awesome question that we would usually associate with a certain other denomination that has better wardrobe for its priests than we do. It says, "How can guilt be a positive force in our lives? How can it be a negative force?" That's a question we ask. I don't know how much they ask it, but anyway, how can guilt be a positive force in our lives? And I think, what do you think about that, Jeff? How can guilt be a positive force in our lives?
Well, it's guilt and contrition and regret are all very closely related. Mm-hmm. But I think this goes back to the whole debate of, is this the difference between godly sorrow and worldly sorrow in the same way? Do you feel guilty because you got caught, because it's not going the way you want it to go, or blah, blah, blah? Or do you feel guilty because you genuinely regret everything that you've done and it still just hangs over you?
Yeah.
And that's to be expected. I think there's times, even though like our guilt can be swept away, even through repentance and making amends, we will always remember those things. And I think we'll always feel, in some sense, guilty because we'll feel responsible. I mean, the Lord does forget our iniquities. He remembers them no more. And we can right the ship, and you see this with Joseph's brothers, that they genuinely regret everything they did. I don't even think it took this experience for them to regret it. I feel like it was pretty immediate in the aftermath of even selling Joseph into slavery. They're almost thinking, like, what have we done?
How could you not, when Jacob's reaction is so catastrophic?
Like, how can you do this? And then it's like, and now he's just stuck in Egypt, and we're Canaanites. We can't just go get him back or anything like that. Like, it's a done deal. So guilt can be a motivating factor, though, and I think it's a good sign if we feel guilt, because it means that we're being reflective and we're trying to assess ourselves and our own situation and our own actions, and hopefully that leads us to take the proper steps necessary, whatever that may be, to fix whatever might be amiss in our lives and to seek reconciliation where reconciliation should be sought.
Yeah, it's really it's part of that recognition of sins. Depending on where you learned how to teach repentance, you have 4 or 5 R's, and the first one's always you got to recognize that you've sinned, and guilt is a good recognition, is a good way to know that you recognize that you've made a mistake. And so then he reveals himself and to them and says, "Hey, this is I'm going to take care of the family," and they go up and get Jacob. Israel, and they bring him down.
Yeah.
And so we really see this amazing change, right? When he leaves his brothers earlier in Genesis and is sold into slavery, he's at his lowest point. He has no property. He is property. And now, even though his family kind of pushed him away, or his brothers did, he's reconciled to them, and he's basically second only to Pharaoh as far as power, and all because he handled well the adversity that he faced, and in a lot of instances helped people when he didn't have to, and in ways that he did not know so often, although at the end he knew he was going to get his family all back together as a result of helping his brothers. In the other times, he didn't know that it was going to produce any benefit for him, and he did it anyway. So this sort of upstart younger brother who really irritated his older brothers seems to have grown and matured a lot, and I guess that's the invitation for us, right, is to have that be the effect of our trials in this life.
And to be compassionate. I mean, I think it's great that we talked about the guilt from the brothers, but that Joseph could have been vengeful very much if he wanted to. He was in a position to just lay waste to all of them if he felt like it, but he never felt that. He just wanted to have great degrees of compassion. I won't read the whole thing, but there's a great quote from President Hinckley where President Hinckley says, most of us have not reached that stage of compassion and forgiveness. It's not easy to reach because selfishness is the cause of our misery, and the healing power of Christ found in the doctrine of going the second mile is what can heal us. Real quick before we go, I guess we can skip the Sister Parkin story. It's a little bit long. But I do want to talk about how Joseph is a type of Christ, which is types of Christ are an interesting thing in the scriptures. And I'm just going to list a few here. Joseph, some of these might be closer than others, but one, Joseph was the favored son of his father. Jesus is the only begotten. Joseph was rejected by his brother, the Israelites. Jesus was rejected by, his brethren, the Israelites. Joseph was sold by his brothers into the hands of Gentiles. Jesus was sold into the hands of Gentiles, the Romans in this case. Judah, the head of his tribe, proposed the sale of Joseph. Judas, of course, actually sold Christ. Joseph was sold for 20 pieces of silver, the price of a slave at this time. Christ was sold for 30 pieces of silver, which was the price of a slave in his age.
Inflation.
Yeah, exactly.
There's a lot of inflation.
And there
over 1,000 years or however much it was.
That's actually a pretty good rate if they've held it down for that long.
Yeah, it's not that bad.
In their attempt to destroy Joseph, his brothers actually set up the conditions that would bring about their temporal salvation. Joseph became a deliverer. And likewise, by being driven to the Gentiles, the conditions were arranged for Christ to be crucified and complete his atoning sacrifice, delivering all mankind. 7, Joseph began his mission of preparing the salvation of Israel at the age of 30. Christ was 30 when he started his mission amongst the people of Jerusalem and its area around. And all of Egypt eventually bowed to Joseph. All will eventually kneel before Christ. And Joseph provided bread for Egypt and saved them all from death, all without cost. And Jesus, the bread of life, did so for all mankind.
That's
awesome. My list. How do you like it?
That's awesome.
Okay, thank you. Just wanted to share that. If I can find the reference, I can tell people. I don't know where the reference is. Look for Sister Parkin, Bonnie D. Parkin, London South Mission, and you'll find a good story. It's good, but we've got to go. So, folks, we hope we'll hear from you soon. Hope you have a great weekend. The Gospel Doctrine is terrific. The Old Testament's awesome, and we hope you'll find great enjoyment from it. Bill, thanks for joining us.
Jeff, thanks for having me.
Great to have you, buddy. Sunday School Bonanza, folks, brought to you by this